very good evening and welcome. You're watching the India Development Debate. I'm Tamanna Inamdar. Frantic negotiations are going on in Washington over the ongoing United States debt ceiling crisis. So much so that it has forced US President Joe Biden to cancel his upcoming trip to Australia, due to which the planned Quad summit of leaders from US, India, Australia and Japan has also been called off. The US hit its borrowing limit earlier in January, and since then the Treasury Department has undertaken several extraordinary measures to provide the government with more cash and avoid default. But as the date nears, hectic parleys are on between Republicans and Democrats. While Democrats have the Senate, Republicans have a majority in the House of Representatives. And with national elections around the corner, the deal seems like an uphill task. Without a deal, the U.S. could enter a default on its $31.4 trillion debt on the 1st of June, which would be a catastrophe for the U.S. economy and global economy. We're already seeing shudders of this US debt ceiling standoff in global markets, and those reverberations could be felt around the world. So this is more than just a political story in the United States. It's one which has many ramifications. Meanwhile, President Joe Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy have also named top emissaries to negotiate a deal to avert default. The deadlock would surely end, as has happened several times in the past. This is part and parcel of US politics. But how does this crisis reflect upon the world's largest economy? And will there be a short solution? Why is it important? We're talking about some of these issues today. Ajay Bagga, chairman of Elyments platforms and market expert, with me on the show. I'm speaking with Anurag Singh, managing partner at Ansid Capital, Geoff, independent emerging markets commentator, also with us on the show. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for speaking with us. Let me start with Mr. Bagga. Is it all about politics at the end of the day? Big election, the Republicans have the House, so they don't want to make it easy. And this keeps happening time and again in the United States. Eventually, everyone agrees because no one wants the US to default. So is this just a long, drawn-out negotiation at this point, or will there be some very real ramifications at the end of this?
Yeah, you summed it up excellently, Tamanna. Overall, it's all about posturing. It's all about politics. It is an artificial ceiling. It's quite remarkable that in the biggest economy in the world, you have a budget process. So you have a budget which is approved by the Congress, but the debt which needs to be raised to fund that budget also is subject to a debt ceiling which needs to be separately negotiated. So it is quite weird, but it is like an known kind of a risk where, we know that it is possible that the US may default if there is no agreement, and how deep that cut would go is anybody's guess. So it's like the Ukraine war. We knew there was a slight chance that Russia might invade. Nobody really thought that a shooting war in the middle of Europe after 75 years is possible, but it happened and it's dragged on. So every time the risk is this only. The big risks had come in 2011 and 2013 when there were deep negotiations. And in 2011, in fact, when finally the deal was done on 2nd August, on 5th August 2011, S&P 500 cut off the AAA rating of the US and it came down to AA+, where it has stayed. And at that time, the US markets had gone down 20%. The bond markets actually saw safe haven buying. So the bond yields fell by about 120 basis points, and gold went up nearly 15%. At that time, we had seen the dollar strengthen. And those are the factors that we are seeing in play right now. Stock markets are a bit complacent. All of us are quite, reassured that there will be a last-minute deal that will come through. But now it's getting tougher. Jamie Dimon last week summed it up well, Tamanna. He says, I'm running a war room once a week right now to understand what we will have to do for customers and for our flows and our balance sheet, our collaterals. He says by the 21st of May, it will become a daily war room. And by the end of May, I'm expecting 3 times a day war room to have started. So I think that sums it up very nicely on how the markets are taking this.
So just before I move on to the rest of the commentary, just to add a bit of tidbits for our viewers, this concept of debt ceiling has been around in the United States since 1917. That's when Congress set it up. And essentially, the political parties, both sides, have to agree to increase this ceiling. And that's not unusual. This has happened 78 times since 1960. When the debt ceiling has been raised, and it was last raised in December 2021, which has now brought it to the current limit of $31.381 trillion. So this is not new. The thing is, you never know when it's going to fall apart, and that's the fear. Anurag Singh, I want to come to you to go a little, in reverse and explain to us why the need again and again to raise the debt ceiling. This time round, why does the United... I know it's a very basic question, but I think it's important to understand context of what we're talking about. Why does the United States need to raise its debt ceiling once again when it's done it in 2021? Is it pointing out to not managing its debt well? How can you explain this?
So, Tamanna, I think US Constitution has certain inbuilt checks and balances, because this is, the democracy which tells the world that democracy works very well because it has checks and balances. This is one of those very elementary checks and balances which keeps a check on how much the government can spend, and the fact that there are 3 legs of the government. There is a president, then there is a Congress, and there is a Senate. It's like a Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha in India, and then the Prime Minister. The system is different because here Prime Minister comes from the ruling party, which is the Lok Sabha, but in US it can't be necessarily said so. So President belongs to the Democratic Party, Congress belongs to Republicans, Senate currently is in the charge of Democrats again. Now all 3 houses have to pass. So the limit, Tamanna, says that the nation cannot borrow beyond a restricted ceiling. And once that ceiling is hit, you need to go back to the Congress to approve further budgets, because ultimately all the purse strings lies with Congress. Why this is important and necessary, Tamanna, is because, look, given a free purse, politicians would recklessly continue to spend for the short term. We see that continuously happening all across the world, even in India, unless there is some reasonable restriction which binds them to cut expenses. Otherwise, they'll just keep raising, and country would keep taxing itself higher and higher to a death spiral. And I think that's why it is there. And more often than not, there is reasonably a conflict where Congress is held by somebody else and president is from some other party, and there has to be a negotiation. Come on, look at this. 2011, when the last default happened, the country had about $16 trillion of debt. Today, it is 32 trillion, just about 10 years. At that pace, the budgetary office says that by 2040, there will be a deficit of $2-3 trillion on the social spending, which needs to be cut. So somebody needs to have that mature conversation in the room and tell the people of the country that, look, dollar is a reserve currency. It's an extreme privilege, but it comes with a set of responsibility, and somebody needs to be responsible to that.
I don't know about the maturity of conversations in the room. There's a lot of panic for sure, and there's a cost to the Republicans willing to increase that debt ceiling. They're telling Biden, for example, roll back all the stuff you promised. You said you'll waive off student debt. We can't do that if you want to increase the debt ceiling. So there's a push and pull, perhaps a gun to the head. There's a negotiation on. Geoff Dennis, I want to understand, do you think this can happen, or is this whole conversation a suspense thriller where we already know what's going to happen at the end of the story?
I think one thing that's not been said so far is that it is particularly difficult to get an agreement this time around because of the tenuous position that Kevin McCarthy, the Republican House Speaker, is in. He only just was voted in after several rounds of voting, and he's really hamstrung by the right wing of his party. So in going into these debt negotiations, he does not want, or he's not going to be able to, given his right-wing caucus or the right-wing part of his caucus, to give up on the idea of major spending cuts. And so getting the Democrats together with Kevin McCarthy so you can get a bill through the House is going to be more tricky than normal. Now, my view is that there will not be a default, and it really depends on what you mean by default. There are several things that default on. The thing that is a big no-no, which is the thing we associate with developing economies recently, such as Argentina and Ghana and Tunisia, is you stop paying the interest on the debt. The US has got to pay something like $19 billion of interest payments in June. There is no chance they will not do that. In the event we do not get a deal by June the 1st, the possibility would be to slow down or cut spending on domestic programs, including Social Security payments, including Medicare, including domestic spending of all sorts. So I think the thing the market really worries about, which is a classic debt default in the style of an emerging market typically, is not going to happen. It just won't happen. And therefore, I view the kind of wobble we're going through now with bonds, bond yields likely to fall in the event that they do default and the dollar strengthening up a little bit later. I think this is another buying opportunity for equities. It just isn't going to happen. The US is not going to default on its interest payments. Come what may, there will be some sort of a deal to prevent that. So people have to be really careful about defining their terms, what we mean by default. The only thing the ratings agencies consider to be a technical default, in inverted commas, is if they stop paying interest on the debt. That isn't going to happen.
Okay, so the worst possible scenario will not happen, but the fact is that there will be some corners to cut. Ajay, Bagga, now here is where it sort of gets interesting. Where, there's going to be a tough negotiation. Does that mean that Biden will eventually have to roll back some of the many things he's promised? In the Indian political lexicon, it would be called freebies. But will he have to roll some of those back? And what are the implications at the end of the day? If everyone knows the outcome, why are markets so nervous? Why is everyone so nervous?
People are nervous, Tamanna, for what Mr. Dennis said very nicely, that the House Speaker's position himself is very tenuous because of the very far-right extreme Republicans. Trump in his CNN town hall was very clear that we should default. And, so there is a lot of rhetoric to that extent in the House with the Republicans that back Trump or follow Trumpist kind of ideology. The risk is there. 140 corporate leaders wrote to the government yesterday and to the House leadership, Senate leadership, asking them to get their act together and ensure that there is an orderly process to either suspend the debt ceiling or to enhance the debt ceiling. They have the option which can be more politically palatable, where they say we are suspending it for now, which allows the government to then borrow, and then later on they will make it kosher. So that option has been exercised in the past when there were no deals happening. This time the risk is both the progressives on the Democrat side and the Trumpist Republicans on the other side. What if their stances are very entrenched and we fail to get a bill which enables the US government to go through? It won't happen on June 1st. They probably will have some money for another 2 weeks, and then June 15th, the quarterly tax payments will start coming in. But you are really, scraping the barrel. And a non-partisan body like the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, has also calculated that probably June 1st is the exit, as Yellen is saying. So the risk is quite clearly the sentimental risk. There is no cross default also. So what is happening is money markets are not buying treasuries which mature in the first 2 weeks of June. Those rates are very high. Those yields have gone very high. People are buying treasuries maturing before or after that, knowing fully well in that 15 days, we might have a lot of volatility. And in case there is a default on any of that paper, US government is such an animal, there is no cross default clause. In banking, if you default on one of your debts, we create a full NPA. We say the entire firm has defaulted. For the US government, that particular stock, that particular treasury will probably be bought up by the Fed. Fed will come to the rescue. They will buy that off, take it off the market, and replace it with something else which is maturing later and is not in default. So there are many ways technically to work around this. There is one, there is one thought that a $1 trillion coin can be issued by the US Treasury, given to the Fed, and a line taken against that. So that's again creating money out of nowhere. So governments never run out of funds in that sense, especially a government like the US. It's not like a third world country. There are many ways that can be worked around, but it's going to cause a lot of volatility, at least for the next.
So what about all the warning signs? Let me come to Anurag Singh on it. Janet Yellen, Treasury Secretary, has said things like, 80 lakh people will lose their jobs. Your pension funds will go out of whack, and there'll be massive destruction, financial destruction. So all of that can happen, right?
Yeah, so I mean, for that moment it can happen, right? But as Geoff and Mr. Bagga said, that there is actually going to be no default, at least on the government debt per se. But for the moment, at least for those 15, 20 days when we are in a panic, as we saw in 2011, markets can go in a tailspin. Tamanna, the interesting part here is that I appreciate Madam Yellen coming and telling the whole world how it can be catastrophic. Well, we all know that. The whole market knows it. The point is they have to talk to each other. And Tamanna, that's the nervousness. Here it is. And I want to just bring in a little connect to the last question that you had with both the experts. You to understand, in US politics, I wouldn't put it that extreme, but it is, both parties have extremes. But ultimately, it's a fight of the left side economics and the right side economics. And Republicans believe in right side economics. But broadly, the Democrats represent people who are not high income, most of them. And they need to have these benefits going, especially before the election. So I think it's a classic fight. It is about whoever gives more room in this negotiation. 2024 elections are at stake, and Republicans want to really cut all the spending that there is. And this time they're right, because not only it's good for the country, it's good overall for the markets, US economy, welfare, everything else, except that the short-termism won't understand it.
Yeah.
Second, Tamanna, politicians love crisis. They would love to see a crisis, and then Biden would emerge and appear to be solving it and spending the heck out of it. That's what they did in COVID. And I think that's where the market is nervous, that this time politicians might let the crisis happen and appear to be solving it.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it. Politicians love crisis because then you can be the hero and solve all the problems. So, Geoff, Dennis, is this in the realm of realpolitik, or are there some very serious underlying economic questions that need to be asked?
Oh yeah, I mean, this is a real crisis, and it has to be fixed. I'm simply making the call that, the complete, unthinkable of not paying the interest on the debt is just not going to happen. I loved your data point at the beginning, 78 rises in the debt ceiling since, I think, 1960, 1970. I can't remember what the date was. That's a fabulous data point. The way you solve this in the long term is getting the country out of its budget deficit. If you have a budget surplus, the level of debt goes down, and then you won't hit a debt ceiling. The last time we had a consistent government surplus, government budget surplus in the US was during the Clinton years of the mid to late 90s. The surpluses year after year. So the way you really solve this problem in the long term is getting the budget into surplus. And we are miles away from that in the US, frankly, at the moment. And therefore, this is going to happen again and again. Two potential short-term solutions which will get us towards an agreement which will prevent a widespread default in June are, number one, a short-term debt ceiling increase only, small amount, short term, we'll be back again in 6 to 12 months doing the same thing. Or secondly, there are apparently, I don't know how big the number is, but there's a chunk of COVID spending money that's already been raised by the government. Maybe that gets put back into the budget, so to speak. That is no longer spent, and that would be a way of trying to bridge the gap between the Democrats and the Republicans. But trust me, the only way to really deal with this problem long term is to get the budget into surplus, and that's going to take a long time from here.
Data point was 78 times. The debt ceiling has been raised 78 times since 1960. You have to fix the underlying problem instead of figuring out how to negotiate to raise it again. And no one seems too concerned about that. But also there's context, right? Post-COVID world, governments have had to spend. The US definitely spent their way out of the pandemic and want to continue to do so. So it's complex. They're tough negotiations. The world is watching. But the smart money is betting that it's a crisis that will eventually be solved. It's one of those stories which has a lot of thrills, but a happy ending at the end of it all. We'll have to wait and see. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us on the show this evening. We'll take a very short break, but we'll be right back with a lot more. Stay tuned.